Welcome to this short video on introducing and integrating quotes into your own writing. When I talk to students about integrating quotes or how to use quotes in their own writing, I often end up cautioning them against dropping quotes in their papers, which is basically a way of describing when a student inserts a quote into their paper without integrating the quote into their own sentence. And this can look something like this. Okay, so if you look here at the bolded sentence, what you can see is you have the quote. They've sort of introduced the quote a sentence previous. They put a period next to it. And then if you look at the quote itself, it's just been plunked into the paper. It hasn't been integrated into the writer's own sentence in any way. The entirety of the sentence is the quote, and then they move on to the next sentence. And this is a problem for a couple of different reasons. So let's stop for a second. We'll talk about why. So there's a few things going on here. One, that bolded sentence is what I mean when I talk about a dropped quote. While the preceding sentence does begin to introduce the idea in the quote, the sentence hasn't in any way been integrated into the writer's sentence. So basically, when you use a quote, you always want to integrate that quote into your own sentence to some effect or to some extent. That doesn't mean that you should be paraphrasing every quote, but it does mean that some part of that sentence should include some of your own words. So often this may take the form of saying something like, according to insert author here, and then put the quote in. You never want an entire sentence to only represent the quote. You always want yourself to be represented somewhere in that quote at some point. Now, you'll notice that I say that introduction to a quote and the integration of the quote. And I like to think of these two things as two separate functions or roles, even though they can often take place at the same time, because they're actually doing two different things. Again, they may be happening in the same words, but it's a good idea to keep track of both functions to make sure that you're doing both things. So to give you an idea of what each of these things are, one, the integration is that grammatical function that I just talked about. So the integration of a quote happens in the same sentence as the quote always. It blends the quote within the writer's own sentence in a grammatically correct way, while also establishing the writer's relationship to the quote. And I'll give you more on that in a moment. That's not the same as the introduction to the quote. Now, the introduction to the quote also happens in the same sentence as the quote, but it can sometimes also begin in the previous sentence or possibly sentences before the quote. It should never really be more than a sentence to a sentence and a half long, however, because you don't want to have excessive plot summary in your lead up to any piece of textual evidence. So what does the introduction do that's different than an integration? What an introduction does is it provides information or context about the quote that is key for the reader to understand the quote as they're reading it. So basically, it's the information or the context about the quote that will make the quote make sense as a piece of evidence for your reader. So the way that I like to keep the distinction between these two roles separate is that the integration is the grammatical part of the equation, and the introduction is what we might call the information or the contextual part of the equation. They might be happening at the same time, but keeping those two things separate makes sure that you can kind of tick off both of those boxes and make sure that you're doing both of those things for every quote. Okay, so to put this in a little bit more concrete terms for you, let's look at two different sentences. Okay, so here we have that same quote. And what I've done here is I've given it two different integrations, but I've used that same introduction and I've integrated it in two different ways. And I did this because I want to show you how these two different integrations will give you subtly different senses of the writer's relationship to this quote. So if we look at the first one, we have individuals in groups become their own prisoners when they turn the aggressive desire to conform against their own individuality. And I just want you to note a couple of things here. One, it's the same information as in the dropped quote version, but what's happened here is by blending those two sentences together, the relationship between the first sentence and the second sentence is made more clear. And also pay attention to the way that that integration has happened. It's grammatically correct. The sentence runs just as cleanly as if the entire sentence had been composed by a single author instead of being a kind of Franken sentence where sentences by two different authors have been blended together. Okay, in the second sentence, we have Ignatieff argues that individuals in groups become their own prisoners when they turn the aggressive desire to conform against their own individuality. So you'll notice here that again, we have the same information, but what we call the integration has changed a little bit. Instead of just saying individuals in groups become their own prisoners when they insert quote, instead it has become Ignatieff argues that individuals in groups become their own prisoners. And there's a subtle but kind of important difference here. In the first quote, the writer of this paper is co-signing onto what their source material written by Ignatieff is saying. So they're actually co-signing by saying, yeah, this actually happens. Individuals and groups become their own prisoners when they do this. In the second one, they aren't saying yay or nay, but they are putting a little bit of distance between themselves and the source by saying, hey, I'm not saying what I think about this and I'm not co-signing on it. All I'm saying right here is that this guy Ignatieff, he argues that individuals and groups become their own prisoners when they turn the aggressive desire to conform against their own individuality. So the way you introduce a quote gives information about the quote, but the way you integrate it not only blends it grammatically, but gives a little bit of an idea as to where you stand in relation to the evidence that you're presenting. And that can be really significant in terms of your relationship to the text and your relationship to the reader. You're giving them a little bit of a clue to how you're introducing your quotes. That said, often one of the easiest ways to introduce a quote is to actually introduce with those kinds of tags, or at least to integrate a quote, is to introduce with those tags that give that attribution to the author. So, so-and-so says, according to so-and-so, insert quote here. So the important thing here is that when you use those types of tags, basically you're kind of staying on the sidelines. You aren't basically co-signing and you aren't rejecting, but all you're saying in that moment is, this person said it. I'm not telling you whether I agree with it or that I don't agree with it. I'm just telling you that's their shtick, right? However, if you have an introduction that just blends it in without mentioning the author at all, you're basically saying, hey, yeah, I agree with this. I'm actually kind of co-opting this into my own voice. Now, the way that you're avoiding co-opting that into your own claim in a way that looks like plagiarism is, of course, that you're using quote marks, which mark the boundary between your words and their words and the citation. That's what makes it clear that you're not trying to steal their ideas. You're giving credit where credit's due. Okay, so to extend this a little bit more, introduction is also important, especially when you are using what we might call case quotes or example quotes, what we often in class can sometimes call story quotes. So often in those cases, the introduction to the quote is going to be necessary in order to give your reader the context so that they can understand the quote. So remember, in academia, you can't always know who's going to be reading your paper or your writing, your argument. So you can't guarantee that, unlike in our class, the person who's reading your text is going to be someone who's very recently read the exact same sources as you. So you have to give a little bit of context whenever you drop a quote about a story or from a story or from an example. You have to give them enough of the setting or enough of the context of the quote so that how it's functioning as evidence in your paper makes sense to somebody who hasn't read that text, or at least hasn't read it recently. So for example, let me show you an example from a reading in our class, but that uses a dropped quote. So let's look at this. Here we have a introduction to the quote, or actually in this case, it's just a topic sentence, right? Group identity can often coerce individuals into an imagined relationship with others and with their own past. So that's your topic sentence claim. And then immediately we follow with an unintegrated quote. So he calls up an old friend on the CB radio. Eustache, he taunts, "Are you still going with that girl?" "Why should I tell you?" the Croat replies, Chetnik psychopath. Pleasantries continue and then they hang up. They talk on the phone most evenings, it appears. So when you look at this introduction and this quote, basically, if you are someone who has not read Ignatieff, you have no idea of the context of the quote. You have no idea how it feeds into the topic sentence. And the discussion of the quote is going to have to do a lot of work to, after the fact, connect those dots for the reader. And that's not really a very effective way to use a quote. Now, you don't want to give the entire story, right? However, you want to give just enough context before the quote so that as the reader is reading that quote, they have an idea of what it's doing and why it matters. Typically, that could be anywhere from a clause, like half a sentence, to a sentence or a sentence and a half. Anything more than that, and you're probably getting into too much plot summary. Okay, so let's look at an example of the same sentence. Okay, here's that same topic sentence. Group identity can often coerce individuals into an imagined relationship with others and with their own past. Sound familiar? Okay, for example, Ignatieff recounts the story of a Serbian soldier during the Yugoslavian Civil War who would fight every day to expel a good friend from his country, yet nearly daily call his friend to catch up as if nothing had changed. Okay, couple things to notice here. Basically, you've got a one sentence kind of potted description of the background of that quote. You've got the main players and the situation all described in that one sentence. Now, how do we keep this grammatically correct? It's not a run-on, because if you look, we've got a colon between the description of the quote, or what's about to happen in the quote, and the quote, and that keeps it from being a run-on. You can think of a colon as essentially the equivalent of an equal sign for words. And that's a very common introduction for long quotes and or block quotes. Now you'll notice as I scroll this down that this is not a block quote. And the reason why it's not a block quote is that it isn't quite 4 full lines in length. It's almost 4 full lines, but it's not quite 4 full lines. And you would need it to be 4 full lines in order to be a block quote. But basically, when you have one of these longer quotes, what you will do is often have a full description in your introduction, plunk a colon in there, and then the other side of it will be your quotes. Now, after that, you'd obviously have your analysis and your discussion where you're really talking about how that quote feeds into and supports your topic sentence. But the introduction is really only there to set the stage with enough information that as they're reading the quote, they have some idea of where it's coming from and why it matters to your topic sentence. That way, when you get to your discussion, what you're really doing there is analyzing the quote instead of then having to back up and give a summary. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Now, again, you don't always have to introduce long quotes with a full sentence and a colon, but that's particularly useful when you have a longer set of quotes, and especially when you have a description of what we might call a story quote or a kind of narrative quote of some kind where you have to set the scene. That's a really good tool to have in your toolkit. So I hope that makes sense to you. Those two things that you want to do, you want to make sure that you integrate that quote into your own sentences. And you want to make sure as well that you introduce the quotes with enough information that those quotes are going to make sense to someone who has never read the text, or who you could imagine maybe read the text 5 years ago, but does not necessarily have all of the details of everything that happened in it right at the front of their mind. So those are the kinds of people that you kind of want to imagine to be your readers. And if you kind of keep that in mind, you'd want to think about what is the bare minimum of information that they would need to know before they hear the quote, before that quote's going to make sense to them. So you don't have to summarize everything. You don't have to reinvent the wheel, but you do have to give them just enough information that that quote's going to make sense to them. So I hope that works for you. As always, you're free to contact me if you have any questions about it. And there will be a related handout on our course page with these details for you if you would prefer this information in that format.